My session precisely is on new historicism. It is actually a product of literary theory in the Anglo-American world. The historical nature of literary works, it was said, had been badly neglected over the first half of the last century of Anglo-American criticism. Anglo-American criticism, which I mean literary theory on English language and literature. The time had come to move beyond the narrowly formalistic or text-centered approaches, including new criticism. Especially students of literature must be aware of a particular school of American criticism, literary theory known as new criticism, who emphasized the importance, the presence of text rather than the context and other historical details. And most of the new criticism, the members of the school of new criticism were concerned about discussing rhetorical devices, features of language, characterization, and so many other features inherent in the text. But at the same time, feminism, feminist literary theory, but in particular, and feminist cultural theory specifically, have become a powerful literary approach exploring the patriarchal, sexist politics, and masculinistic conventions of culture, art, society, etc. The new historical approach was needed, especially in this context, to overcome the limitations of formalistic, new critical approaches in Anglo-American academia of English. Specifically, we need to focus on 4 important factors connected to the rise of conceptualization of new historicism, which are post-structuralism, the philosophical, theological, and linguistic movement, which challenged and dismantled many conventions of structuralism and other existing conventions existed in those areas. Another important factor was the rise of postmodernist assumptions of art, philosophy, history, and language. Specifically, Jacques Derrida's assumption of notion of deconstruction of historical texts and literary texts. That was far more important than any other theoretical formulation which influenced new historicism. And the 4th and most important factor was the school of cultural materialism of Raymond Williams, Terry Eagleton, on the basis of thoughts of Antonio Gramsci, Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault. That also, cultural materialism was also a very important, influential feature of new historicism, which we'll discuss at the end of the session. The first and most important, I believe most of the students belong to the discipline of history, whether UG or PG. You should note a very important factor in this. New historicism has no impact upon the academic discipline of historiography, historical studies, but it is far more, importantly connected with English literary theory, not even to other literary theories, because French literary theory was very important in post-structuralism, postmodernism, feminism. But new historicism evolved and existed only in the domain of Anglo-American English literary studies. And fundamentally, this is an effort to connect text, the literary text, with its context, the cultural, historical, and sociological, backgrounds, context of evolution of that literary text. There is a very important activity in historical studies to examine and explore the details of a particular historical cultural context by examining the literary text belong to that area. For instance, Ilamkulam Kunyapilla formulated a series of theories based on his studies of Unnunili Sandesham. D.D. Kosambi, who instituted the materialistic Marxist discipline of historical approach in Indian history, started his studies on epics based on studying the historical, cultural, and sociological details of Indian of epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, and many other. Romula Thapar on the other side, her studies of ancient history is also based on textual analysis of literary textual analysis of a particular cultural and sociological, literary context. But new historicism is actually an antithesis to this approach of studying the literary text to explore the cultural and sociological context. Instead, new historicism attempts to explore and examine the literary text based on the cultural and historical context. This is the first major important factor we need to understand. That is why I've argued at the beginning that though the name is New Historicism, this is nothing to do with the academic discipline of history and historicism. The New Historicism, as by general argument, this movement has come to be called, is unified by its disdain from literary formalism. I mean, the literary formalism of the movement in the 1920s and 30s especially in the United States and in England, English universities, called New Criticism and literary formalism, etc. Specifically, leaders of the movement, Brook and leaders of the movement, New Historicism, describe themselves as unhappy with the exclusion of social and political circumstances, which we refer here as context. The social, political, and cultural context, circumstances, situations of a literary text, we usually refer in future as context. One second, please. And so the exclusion of such cultural, social, and political circumstances from the interpretation of literary works, and the exponents of this movement, what we call as New Historicism nowadays, were impatient with the settled view that a poem or a novel or a play or any sort of artifact is a self-contained object, a verbal icon, a logical code surrounded by a texture of irrelevance. New historicism appear to offer a distinctive approach, a novel approach, a rigorous method, along with the opportunity to salvage an individual's political commitments. See, exactly the way how feminists, radical feminists, and new wave feminists have interpreted patriarchal literary texts by examining the masculinist, patriarchal, and male dominant discourses inherent in such texts. Indeed, at times, the new historicism seemed almost designed to methodize the political interpretation of literature. We need to be very careful about here at the moment, because the methodological approach to political interpretation of literary text is the most significant factor, and the very idea of a methodological approach to political interpretation of literature was influenced by Derridian idea of deconstruction, deferring of meanings, etc. The movement has gained radical acceptance in English departments in England, first in the United States and then in England. Especially many people consider New Historicism as an offshoot of the Berkeley campus. I mean, the University of California campus at Berkeley, which is considered to be one of the most radical experimental campuses in the United States. All radical politically oriented leftist movements have some sort of a root in the Berkeley campus. The movement, New Historicism, already has its classical, texts, especially two important authors, Stephen Greenblatt and Louis Adrien Montrose, are worth remarkable in this context. Stephen Greenblatt's work on Renaissance self-fashioning explored Renaissance, especially Shakespeare, Renaissance texts, especially Shakespeare, on the basis of the idea of self-fashioning which took place during the Renaissance in English society. And the first instance of the use of the term New Historicism is also in Stephen Greenblatt's book on Renaissance self-fashioning. Louis Adrien Montrose published an uncollected essays on Shakespeare, again, the Renaissance product Shakespeare, especially the one entitled Shaping Fantasies. It is its own, and New Historicism started its own journal. That movement, literary academic movement, started to publish a journal called Representations, and it was published by the University of California Press. There have always been literary history, especially in studies of William Shakespeare's works, and literature from the early modern period. New historicists and cultural materialists distinguished themselves by bringing a diverse range of influence from anthropology, Marxism, historiography, theories of historiography, and continental philosophy to bear on their work to consider contextual questions from fresh new perspectives. Anthropology, obviously, Clifford Geertz, Marxism, Antonio Gramsci, Louis Althusser, Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton. Theory of history, mainly Michel Foucault, and continental philosophy, Martin Heidegger and Hans George Gardner. New Historicism as a movement, as an academic movement, is chiefly a specifically beginning at Berkeley, as I told you, and developed and is connected to the development of a study of early modern literature, which came to prominence in the early 1980s, following the publication of Stephen Greenblatt's Renaissance of Self-Fashioning, which the year of publication is 1980. We need to understand, this is particularly for the students of history, we need to understand that there are three important stages in the evolution and development of English language. Before 11th century, we refer the kind of English which existed at that time as Old English. Between 11th and 16th century, 15th century is known as Middle English, and from 15th century to the present, from the times of Geoffrey Chaucer to the present, is known as Modern English. So the upcoming interest in the 1980s in connection with studies on early modern English literature, particularly with the Renaissance, English Renaissance, or European Renaissance, and specifically English Renaissance, is worth remarkable in this context. And most of the exponents of New Historicism were concerned about, they were interested in the early modern, particularly Renaissance English literature. Cultural materialism, meanwhile, also initially focused on the early modern period as chiefly a British development, which came to prominence with the publication of Jonathan Dallimore. Jonathan Dallimore visited Kerala last year, and he spoke in Kannur University and many other places. Jonathan Dallimore's Radical Tragedy, which was published in 1984, is considered to be one of the phenomenal attempts in the domain of New Historicism. And a collection of essays that Dallimore edited with Alan Sinfield, entitled Political Shakespeare, which was published in 1985, is also significant in this regard. And many other writers, contemporary writers on Shakespeare, also used the ideas from New Historicists, such as Yancourt, Shakespeare or Contemporary, or Anielumba, many Shakespeares.
May I
request you to kindly switch off your mics, please? Please switch off your mics, please. Okay. Because of the two approaches emerging in the same area of the discipline, roughly at the same time, and in constant dialogue, often taking the opposite sides of debates, New Historicism and cultural materialism have frequently been compared and contrasted or viewed as two sides of the same coin. In connection with this, these two disciplines, they are not actually two disciplines. Cultural materialism was fueling, or New Historicism was drawing its actual theoretical substance from cultural materialism. and the idea of materialistic approach to culture and history in many ways. So, New Historicism in total was influenced from another movement in cultural studies known as cultural materialism. We'll have definitely a session for discussion immediately after this lecture, and its special methods of interpretation. New Historicism, which opposed the conventional modes of historical studies for two reasons. Historical approach, historiography, traditional history was more concerned about archaeological, historical excavations and objects, historical artifacts, etc. But at the same time, New Historicism is more concerned about, not more concerned, but it's only concerned about the practice of interpretation, which New Historicists have adopted from hermeneutics, a domain of philosophy which is about interpreting ideas. So interpretation is the first and foremost idea of New Historicists, in contrast with exponents of history, students of history, or academics of history. And the second is interpretation has always something to do with the question of representation, which is primarily a post-structuralist, postmodernist assumption, in which the relationship between the object and the verbal image, the verbal symbol, is vanishing in a peculiar way. Ferdinand de Saussure's linguistic approach states that the relationship between the in a semiotic or semiologic in the American way, so the French way, or the semiotic in the American way, the relationship between the signifier, the object image, and the signified, the linguistic image, is challengeable, questionable, troublesome. And as Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, says, the capital S, that is signifier, slides over the object image signified. So this problematic of within the semiotic question of sign, S-I-G-N, sign, which is composed of signifier and signified, the object image is the verbal image and the object image, is problematic, has become problematic. And this is what exactly the new historicists, the exponents of new historicists have adopted immediately as a beginning of their antithesis to traditional historians and historiography. This, based on the special methods of interpretation, hermeneutics, they are practiced by a large number of critics in England and America. For example, Jonathan Dallimore, Jane Tompkins, John E. Wayne, Walter Ben Michaels, Catherine Gallagher, etc. And it has set off an enthusiasm of historical research. The central statement of its themes is the introduction to Stephen Greenblatt's Renaissance self-fashioning. The idea of Renaissance, how the idea of Renaissance self-fashioning states that how the Shakespearean characters have fashioned themselves in accordance with the Renaissance values, and how in Merchant of Venice, Shylock was beaten publicly and set as another. In Othello, how the Moor has constituted the other of the English society, etc. Even Even the title suggests the main focus of the movement. Within the ranks of the new historicism, the areas of new historicism, literature is considered to be one of the social forces that contributes to the making of individuals. It acts as a form of social control. Although most all new historicists are careful to distinguish themselves from Marxist critics, the fact remains that the central task of the new historicism is exactly the same as that of Marxist criticism, which begins not with Marx, but the interpreters of Marx. Say, for example, George Lukács, Louis Thrissur, and others. First, to call into question the traditional view of literature as an autonomous realm of discourse. This word discourse also will have other implications soon. We'll learn soon how discourse, there's actually a Foucauldian term which intervened in the dialogue within the spectrum of new historicism with its new problems, forms, principles, activities, and then to dissolve the literary text into the social and political context from which it issued. In fact, the new historicism tries explicitly to solve the theoretical difficulty in Marxist criticism or Marxian approach to literature, art, of relating the cultural superstructure to the material base. It's very important. For instance, Slavoj Žižek, throughout his career as a philosopher, as a critic of Marx, and of course, who adopted Marx and Lacan as his as his philosophical material, stated that what Karl Marx missed out in his study is what was that Lacan gained. That is a question of desire. The study of desire in Hegel. Marx completely missed out the idea of desire in Hegel, but Lacan studied the base of desire in Hegel. Okay, so new historicism, in a sense, was trying to connect or to resolve the fundamental crisis in Marxist criticism in connecting the superstructure, cultural superstructure with the material base. Cultural materialism has become an essential part of new historicism through this very powerful yet strange alliance of interpreting and connecting both cultural superstructure and the material base. Let's proceed with 4 important factors, or I would call it as 4 pillars of new historicism. I would like to bring down 4 important points. Literature, the first, literature is historical, which means that a literary work is not primarily the record of one's mind, a record of one mind's attempt to resolve certain formal issues, problems. It is, by and large, a social and cultural construct shaped by more than one consciousness. The proper way to understand it, therefore, is through the culture and society that produced it. Basically, literature is a cultural product. Literature then is not a distinct category of human activity. It must be assimilated, related, brought down to history, which means a particular vision of history. The third point, again, is Like works of literature, humans themselves are social constructs. The sloppy, like composition of social and political forces. There is no such a thing as human nature that transcends history. Renaissance, for instance, Renaissance man belongs inescapably and irretrievably to the Renaissance. There is no continuity between the Renaissance man and us. History is a series of ruptures between ages and generations and humans. I believe this is the most important point while studying New Historicism. The discontinuity, the lack of a collective unconscious, etc. As a result, the historian, sorry, one second. The historian critic is trapped in his own historicity. The historian, literary critic of modern times is trapped in his own or her own historicity. No one can rise above his own social formations, his own or her own ideological upbringings. Sorry. A modern reader can never experience a text as its contemporaries experienced it. While Jan Kot, a very renowned Polish critic of Shakespeare, wrote the essay Shakespeare or Contemporary, and examined how the bloodsheds, wars, revenges were taken place in Hamlet, in other plays of Shakespeare, unlike Seneca, the Italian playwright. What he didn't, what our new historians criticize is that he has his own historicity, his own ideological context and social formations. Given this fact, the best of modern historicist approach to literature can hope to accomplish, as Catherine Belsey, a very important 20th century critic of literature, said, to use the text as basis for the reconstruction of an ideology. This is fundamentally the task of the new historicists. They attempt to use literary text as basis for the reconstruction of an ideology pertinent and visible in a literary text. The doctrine of historicity. Well, let's go back to, not go back to, but go into the details of the philosophical formulations which contributed significantly to the evolution of the discipline of new historicism. From various quarters. Doctrine of new historicity is basically Heideggerian, a Martin Heidegger's motif that came to the movement through the writings of, as I mentioned earlier, German hermeneutical philosopher Hans Georg Gadamer. The new historicist conception of ideology is not precisely that of Marx, but rather than that of French structuralist Marxist Louis Althusser. There is something very important in the evolution of new 20th century French thought, where they have started to understand. See, whether it's Louis Althusser, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jean-Paul Sartre, Raymond Beauvoir, or Jacques Lacan, Roland Barthes. They were all influenced by, more deeply than Marx, by the interpretation of Hegel. Marx also, as Louis Althusser said, là pour Marx. Marx was, somehow trying to interpret the dialectical Hegel. or Althusser's The Spectre of Hegel, about the spectre who existed in Hegel. Spectre actually a coinage by Marx. The spectre of capitalism, takes over Europe. So it was through the seminars by Alexander Koyev in the 30s in the École, the pratique of fashion, that is contemporary school of practice in Paris. So that's a very important idea, but we needn't explain the whole thing here. Louis Althusser's approaches to Marxism and Hegel has influenced tremendously new historicists. The figure of late Michel Foucault, especially during his writing, history of sexuality, or discipline and punish, the history of prisons. The birth of prisons. I was trying to read the French word. The birth of prisons was so influential and significant in the development of the discipline called New Historicism, and which are very important. Foucault's assumptions and concepts are very important in the understanding of New Historicist movement, and it permeates the New Historicist conception of history as a succession of epistates. I believe you are familiar with the word epistemology. Epistemology is a field of study which deals with fields of knowledge. Epistemology. And Foucault has, especially in his work, The Archaeology of Knowledge. Archaeology, the word has a different meaning. We can, in a very fundamental way, we can define archaeology, the word archaeology, as layers. Archaeology of knowledge is something like layers of knowledge. In that work, Foucault brought out an idea, the idea of epistemes, the smaller units of epistemology which enables the practice of knowledge. And history, Foucault has conceived in two ways. First, history is a succession of epistemes, small layers of knowledge, small conceptions of knowledge, or structures of thought that shape everyone and everything within a culture. At the same time, he has brought in the idea of the discursivity of history. History as a discursive act. Discursivity of history. Also, that's also important. A historical age is conceived in Michel Foucault's work, especially in Discipline and Punish, as a structure of thought held together by the same discursive practices. In Discipline and Punish, the New Historicism was truly influenced by this particular work, Discipline and Punish, the birth of prisons in Western penal systems, in which that work begins with a terrifying, I wouldn't say beautiful, a terrifying account of the execution of Robert Francois Damiens, who attempted the assassination of King Louis XV. And the murderers of father, the king, they were all executed in a peculiar way. They were quartered by drawing houses into four directions. And there was a huge mass watching that instance. And that was considered the last public executions in France during the monarchic age. So that was I was deviating from the main point. Therefore, the historical age, as per Michel Foucault, is conceived as a structure of thought held together by the same discursive practices. Through these a distinctive terminology, exponents of new historicism brings us the major practitioners of new historicism. They brought us discursive practices, representations, mediations, contradictions, and ruptures or subversions. And the new historicism offers to students of literature the joy of new explanations and new paradigms. The earliest deliberations on new historicism was primarily a method of power analysis. Let's go back to how, apart from Heidegger and Michel Foucault, how anthropology, structural anthropology, post-structural anthropology has influenced new historicist approaches, and how cultural materialism has manifested itself in the concatenation of ideas in new historicism. New historicism is primarily a method of power analysis. See, Foucault's power bar knowledge was another influential text in the analysis, in the textual analysis of new historicists. And this idea of power and its implications, connections with knowledge was much influenced by the anthropological studies of Clifford Geertz, Clifford, Clifford, Geertz, whose interpretation of culture, which was published in 1973, and you see, I'm trying primarily to locate three important cardinal, sources of the evolution of the philosophy, the fundamental philosophy of new historicism. The resources are not actually historians, but theoreticians of history, anthropologists, and literary theorists. The first is definitely Clifford Geertz, his interpretation of culture, and the second is Hayden White, H-A-Y-D-E-N, Hayden White, W-H-I-T, Hayden White's book Meta-History, which is actually a literary study of historical approach in literature, which was published also in 1973. And as I told you earlier, Foucault's Discipline and Punish, the birth of prisons in Western penal system. New historicism can therefore be seen as a fusion of literary criticism, historical anthropology, in exactly the kind of anthropology practiced by Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz in interpretation of cultures, he studied the Javanese cockfight and coined certain important terms such as thick description. Okay, we'll come to that later. Therefore, the fusion of literary criticism, historical anthropology, and postmodern historiography, which comes in the domain of Hayden White, and the power discourse analysis in the works of Foucault. See, let's go back to Clifford Geertz's work. He, after studying the Javanese cockfight, where some sort of betting is going on, in the surface there is nothing related to money, but the cockfight. He coined the idea of thick description. His method of attempting to understand a different culture as much as possible from its own point of view. And its example is an alien encountering a cheeky schoolboy. This is another example who's cited in interpretation of cultures. A schoolboy winking. In order for the alien to understand the wink as a signal that the boy might be about to get up to some mischief, rather than as simply the contraction of some muscles and skin tissue, the alien must study the boy's culture from the inside out. We can see how new historians use a similar approach to literary texts from the past. See, for example, not in the Jew of Malta, in Shakespeare's play, Shylock was often beaten in public because there was a very powerful social attempt to cite the Jew as the other, the public other of the English. And as I told you earlier, in Othello, the Moor is always positioned as the public other. The second important concept from Clifford Geer's is the idea of local knowledge. And it is based on the method of viewing cultures exclusively in the context of their time and place. For example, local knowledge of a Christopher Marlowe play would be located in London in the 1580s and early 1590s somewhere, and specifically in the theatre scene. There is something very particular about the Elizabethan theatre, which was studied by the new historicists, which was intrinsically connected with the capitalism of based on both sides of the river Thames, and the playhouses. The theatre houses were built and burned and built again on the basis of on the reverberations of the capitalist in the flow of money, to be very precise, in London at that time. The third point is from Hayden White, the Poetics of History. Hayden White recognizes history as a construct by historians, and is therefore a form of storytelling with narrative conventions, which actually paved the way for a lot of arguments between traditional historians and new historicists, or people who adopt new historicists. The only thing is the argument. There is no point in arguing. Historians, base their arguments on the objects excavated, archaeologically excavated, or objects of history, or whatever, really present, but the new historicists are trying to interpret, represent something in language, and not a true or objective account of past events. It is nothing other than a storytelling, and in accordance with narrative conventions. History is nothing more than storytelling, and in accordance with the narrative conventions. And in this way, history is textual and can be read as one might read a poem. That's why Hayden White used the term poetics of history. This idea became important for new historicists. For example, Stephen Greenblatt and Louis Montrose, who came to describe their work as cultural poetics. And the third is power knowledge, the intrinsic relationship between power and knowledge as explored by Michel Foucault in Archaeology of Knowledge, and the discipline and punish. Generally, the idea of new historicism is a form of anti-humanism which has a long history in European philosophy, from times of Spinoza to Friedrich Nietzsche to Michel Foucault and others, because it tends to view individuals exactly like Gies and Clifford Gies and Foucault as entirely products of their time and place, with few useful natural instincts that are not culturally induced. Therefore, new historicism is also a form of anti-positivism. I'm referring to logical positivism, which was a very powerful, philosophical movement in Europe. As per Hayden White, the certainty of ever establishing true or objective knowledge is always frustrated. And the traditional view of scholarship as impartially marshalling evidence towards this end exposed as a self-deluding myth. The idea of true and objective knowledge is now exposed in the studies of new historicism as a myth. New historicists seem more directly influenced by the cultural, materialist perspective too. So let us briefly sum up the idea of new historicism using the following terms: that there is no human essence. The first idea, there is no human essence, as Stephen Greenblatt says, and that every expressive act is embedded in a network of material practices in a particular time and place. So all expressive acts, including literature, is intrinsically embedded in a network of material practices in a particular time and place. This idea was essentially taken from cultural materialism and Marxism. And the second is culture has the structural properties of a text, and can therefore be analyzed in the same way as a text. The third idea is the second idea is culture has the structural properties of a text, of a literary text, any sort of text. Text is the idea of text is taken from Derrida's idea of deconstruction, and that is not limited to literary text, and can be analyzed as a text in any context. The third idea is that literary texts are inextricably bound to this cultural text, the context. Cultural text is context through a network of other texts and discourses, all of which are open to the same form of analysis. That power, the fourth idea is the notion of power and its connection with knowledge. Power will always seek to contain dissidents, and that this drive for containment must be overcome if genuine subversion is to be achieved. The structures of power are to be dismantled to find out the genuine structures of subversion and degradation. The fifth and last point is that is possible to produce a counter-history or counter-histories on the basis of histories, that is the idea of histories that explore what is only glimpsed or ignored in dominant historical accounts through an engagement with the real lived experience of people as documented by anecdotes, as documented everywhere. The idea of the dominant historical accounts or the cultural dominant is an idea taken from the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci and his work entitled Prison Notebooks, so influential in the formulation of cultural materialism, where he brings down, he brought out two important ideas of the cultural dominant and the hegemony, cultural hegemony. Both these ideas are so influential in the formulation of the academic, conceptualizations of cultural materialism by Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton. And new historians have adopted this idea from cultural materialism in the formulation of counter histories in new historicism.